It's 7:30, so I think we should get the show on the road. First, I want to acknowledge we're gathering on Treaty 4 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. My name is Louise Greenberg. I've got many connections to the university and to Regina. At the end of, the middle of April, I finished completed 5 years as Deputy Minister for Advanced Education in the Government of Saskatchewan. I spent 32 years working for the Government of Saskatchewan in various roles. I now joined in July, had a little 2-month holiday, and joined Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy as an executive in residence. So I've been active at the university, getting involved in a number of workshops, getting to know people across the campus, so it's been great. I'm serving as a moderator tonight in place of John Hopkins, who was unable to be here. He really deeply sends his apologies. And I was asked by President Timmons to fill in for John. President Timmons knows I've got a real keen interest in the universities and how they contribute to our communities. Just to give you some historical context, universities have been in existence since 1239, with the University of Bologna being the first university. So there's a lot of history behind universities. I want to give you a little bit of background on today's lecture and how it got started. It's called the Forward Together. And the Forward Together lecture series started in 2009. It was started by President Timmons and the 3 presidents of the Federated Colleges. The idea in starting this was to promote their shared commitment to social justice. Past lectures have included
I think the mic's on.
Vianne and Father Gregory Hill. This year's lecture was inspired by Universities Canada, the organization that represents over 100 universities and colleges across Canada. They encouraged universities to hold events in 2017 for Canada's 150th birthday. It's a time to look back, but it's also a time to look forward. What kind of country do we want to have and live in 2067, which will be the time of our bicentennial? There are events taking place across Canada being promoted on Twitter with the hashtag MyCanada2067. So I encourage you, if you're a tweeter, to use that hashtag tonight. The presidents decided to coordinate this Universities Canada initiative with the Forward Together lecture. This is the 10th annual Forward Together lecture, so it really seemed like a natural fit. All of them have a shared interest in universities, in students, and in their successes. They're always concerned about the university's future, and they wanted to focus on a key topic: will universities exist in 2067? We're going to explore that through a moderated panel discussion tonight. I'd like to introduce the panelists. Dr. Vianne Timmons has been president of the university since 2008. This is her 2nd term, and she will shortly begin a 3rd term. Her research interests include inclusive education and family literacy. The university has grown a lot in her time here in terms of students, community involvement, infrastructure, and programs. Our next panel member is Dr. Bryan Hillis. Bryan is the president of Luther College and has had that role since 2010, and he's responsible for both the high school and the university campus. Dr. Hillis has a long history with Luther. He did his undergraduate degree here and then was a faculty member. He's been a distinguished religious studies scholar and was a Rhodes Scholar as a student. Luther's motto is think deeply, act passionately, and life faithfully. He embodies that motto more than anyone. Our next panel member is Dr. Mark Dockstator. Dr. Dockstator is president of the First Nations University of Canada and has had that role since 2014. Dr. Dockstator is a member of the Oneida Nation of the Thames in Ontario. He has a doctorate in law. He is the first First Nations person in Canada to graduate with such a doctorate. Due to his expertise, he has served in many key advisory positions, including Special Advisor to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Our final panelist is Dr. John Meehan. He's been president of Campion College since 2013, and he's originally from Nova Scotia. Dr. Meehan is a Jesuit. He's a member of the Society of Jesus. He is a historian by trade, but a true Renaissance man with many interests, including the ability to speak 5 languages. He's got a strong commitment to community and to students. This is a really rare opportunity to have 4 post-secondary presidents in one room having discussions and answering questions. This should be interesting and enjoyable. I'm looking really forward to it, and I know you are too. So let's get started. I'm going to explain the format first. I'm going to pose some questions. We're going to have a moderately free-ranging discussion over the course of 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll follow up for a short time period from the audience from questions from you. You should note that this event is being recorded, so by being here, if you're going to ask questions, you're consenting to being recorded in the presentation. I'm going to take a seat and we're going to start with the questions. So I've got a first opening question that I'm going to ask. It's a general question. Do you think universities will exist, or at least in a form similar to they are today, by the time of Canada's bicentennial occurs in another 50 years? If so, why, and if not, why not? The other part of the question is that, do you think the Canadian universities will become more like the private universities in the United States? So I'll open it up to whoever would like to take the question first.
Do you want me to go first? Sure. You're looking at me, guys, right?
Ladies first.
So let me first begin that universities are closing. St. Gregory's University, a small private liberal arts college in the United States, is recently closed, and Grace University recently closed for financial reasons. There is a threat out there. The Harvard Business School Professor Clayton Christensen has said that half of the United States colleges and universities will be bankrupt or closed in a decade. That's 10 years time. So in 50 years, will universities still exist? Well, I actually think they will. I think they will, and I think that because I'm reflecting back when I started university was less than, but not much, 40 years ago. And I can't believe how much time has gone, like that I can actually say I've been connected to a university for 40 years. And there have been lots of changes, and lots has stayed the same. So it's interesting. I think we will have universities, but I do think that they will be different than they are today. Look at newspapers, right? Look at newspapers and what's happening to them, in particular in the last decade. So there's a cautionary tale here for sure. Universities, if we are not nimble, if we are not ready to change, I think we'll have to be more customized in our training. I think we're going to have to be more flexible for our students, but I still think there will be a place that students come to learn in a collective and learn together. But I think there will have to be in the next 50 years significant changes to meet the societal changes. So that's what I think. Do you disagree or agree with me?
Go ahead, Doctor.
John, what do you think?
Well, as Dr. Greenberg mentioned, my background is as a historian. And as she mentioned, universities have been with us since the 1200s. Universities have survived periods of war, periods of upheaval, and universities will survive what we're going through now. I have no doubt. People continue to value university education. Employers continue to value it. So universities will be here in 50 years, I have every belief. But as Dr. Timmons has said, they will be different. They will change. And I think that's a good thing. Because if we look in our province here, Saskatchewan will be different in 50 years. We look at the demographics of this province. We see the shifts that are going to occur, particularly the rise in the Indigenous population. And what gives me a lot of hope is that our university, University of Regina, is ahead of the curve. 14% of our students are self-declared Indigenous. I'm not sure how that compares to other universities in the country, but my sense is we are among the leaders in the country. So that's something I think to be very proud of and to keep developing. So universities will be here in 50 years. We have to change. The diversity is something that we've embraced that bodes well for the future. The other thing we've embraced is technology. Technology is radically altering everything we do. The students that I teach, I've been told they're not even millennials anymore. We're into Gen Z. So they they only know social media. They've only known the internet. So things have changed, and I think the universities are embracing it. But we have to be ready for the other big changes like artificial intelligence and other major changes that are ahead. But I'm sure I feel quite confident that universities will still be here in 50 years' time.
Okay, Mark, well, I'm not sure what there's left to say, but one of the things that occurred to me as I was preparing for this question is that it seems to me if you don't have university, something else is going to have to take its place. As Voltaire said about the existence of God, to paraphrase, as Jaroslav Pelikan did, if the university did not exist, it would be necessary to invent it. So I think that it's easy for us all to agree that universities would be here and they will change. I certainly agree with the idea that technology is changing it. I don't know if we've really come to grips yet with how much technology will change it. As our students, as I watch our daughters now in their 20s embrace technology, technology is so much a part of what they were. I've got Vianne beat by 3 years. I was an undergraduate here 43 years ago.
I wasn't 40. I said less than 40.
Less than 40, sorry.
You got me beat by a lot more than that.
That's right. So, but technology was just not nearly as much a part of my undergraduate experience. It is not just a part of an undergraduate's experience now, it's part of a young person's experience. And that is going to make a huge difference. If I have a concern about what universities will look like, it is the expectations of society that we are providing people with credentials. And I think that that is a big change. Mind you, Pelikan, when he was writing in 1992, also engaged this question and said that there is a higher expectation of that. I think in 25 years, though, the expectation is even higher. Students come for credentials. Industry and business and government is expecting that there will be credentials produced. And that to me is a real danger because I don't know if we're actually dealing with an education as I would like to see, an education of the whole person, an education that embraces how we actually learn as opposed to just learning knowledge. This is one of the exciting things about technology, of course, is that we know that all the knowledge is in your back pocket. It's right there in your smartphone, if you like. But what universities will be there for is as a community of scholars to help us learn how to use technology and any other means that we can in order to make a difference, to expand the boundaries of knowledge, and of course to pass that knowledge and ultimately that wisdom on.
Well, nothing more to say. It's all been said. Of course, when we're all academics, so of course whenever we get a question, we do our research. And so I started my research and I asked Siri. No. So doing part of my research and I looked up, and fortunate for us, we have Ken Coates, who's on our board of governors for First Nations University. And he has an article of universities, the very same question, what do universities look like essentially in 40 years? And I loved his opening line where he said that only a fool or an academic would try to guess what universities will look like in 40 years. And since we've got half that equation, we'll dive into it. And he goes into it and he lays out very well how it's going to change the differences and the similarities. And so, seeing as that there was material out there already, I took a different approach. And what I did is I went to our philosophers. I went back and talked to some elders. And what seems to be a clear, evident question to me is not always the same way that elders will look at the same question. So I went to an elder that I worked with quite extensively, and he's familiar with universities and has lectured at universities. And I asked him the question, so will universities exist in 50 years' time? And that's a good question. Who's universities? And I said, what do you mean, whose universities? He said, well, you're First Nation University. Are you talking about our universities or are you talking about their universities? I said, I don't know, I didn't make the distinction. And he goes, well, depends on your perspective then. If you're talking about, will our universities exist in 50 years' time? Yeah, and there'll be more of them. If you're talking about their universities, they can answer that question very well. But he took a very different tact and looked at it from the perspective of will Indigenous universities exist in 50 years' time, and what will they look like? And of course, First Nations University was a great experiment 40 years ago, starting here at the University of Regina, and it's grown to be a wonderful institution and a national leader. And from that perspective, the elder was looking at that and saying, will our universities exist in 50 years' time? Yes. Will they be the same as they are right now? Absolutely not, because there'll be more of them. And other universities will be doing the similar things that we thought of 40 years ago. And we see it here at the University of Regina, we see it here at the colleges, we see it here across Canada, where Indigenous-based education has been changing the face of universities, especially here, I think as mentioned previously, as a national leader as well. So it was a different tact. It was something that I didn't really think of myself as being president of First Nations University. I just assumed Western-based universities, and when they started in the millennia of experience behind it. But the question from the perspective of that elder, which really interested me, was, will our universities exist in 50 years' time? And the question, absolutely they will. They already have for 40 years. Next 50 is going to be great, and there'll be more of them across Canada because of the example that we're setting here at University of Regina.
I'm just going to ask one more general question before I get into specifics, and it was something that Dr. Hillis had talked about in terms of technology and the role. And the question is, you can make an argument that in terms of applied research companies, like Tesla or SpaceX, or even look at Apple, show that the private sector can be more innovative, do things more cheaply. They can go way beyond what universities can do. So in light of that, what arguments do you think we should make for governments, industry, and the public to continue funding that type of research at universities? And I'll preface one thing, because if you, this is some of my own thoughts, if you think of someone like Steve Jobs, he never finished university, dropped out. He was a dreamer, but he hired people who were quite competent, graduate engineers. He hired the implementers. And so it's always the yin and the yang that goes on in these companies. But what I'd like to open up is the whole area of research and the competition that exists at times between what private companies can do and what universities can do, and where you think the role should be for funding.
So if you don't mind, I'll start, just because it's easier to start, and then you can, others can fill in the gaps. I think we're mistaken if we want to hide our heads in the sand and say that we don't want industry funding research. I think it's going to happen. I think it's actually always happened that way. If you, I'm a historian of thought as opposed to a historian as John is, but there's always been industry funding applied research. It is much more prevalent now, one can argue, and certainly it's not to be ignored, I don't think. But I do think that there must remain a place for what I will call curiosity-based research that is not just applied. And I looked for some examples. I know that innately I feel this, but I wanted to find some examples, and it's not that hard to find it looking on the internet, using that technological tool, to find lots of examples of just curiosity-based research that intersects with applied research and that produces something else altogether. So just a couple of examples. John Tyndall, a 19th century philosopher, was curious about why the sky was blue. Okay, he conducts a number of experiments. He comes up with the whole idea of a spectrum of light and that it bends in a certain way and produces a blue sky during the majority of the day, except at sunset and sunrise when you get red rays and so on. Okay, so all very nice, interesting, curiosity-based research. But what we don't remember oftentimes is that the results of that research also led to a greater understanding of how the human lungs work. I'm not going to go into all the details of how this happened, but I trust me that this is what happened, that it actually helped lead to the discovery of the penicillin bacteria, to other heat-resistant bacteria, all because of his analysis of light waves and particles and so on, and the development of the gastroscope and the bronchoscope. Another example more recently, 2011, John Sullivan was studying black holes, something I have no idea about. Hawking radiation, the mechanism by which black holes are hypothesized to evaporate. But through that investigation, he determined, I mean, one could argue what a complete waste of money, how stupid, what possible application that has. But I will bet that the majority, if not every single one of us, made use of the results of that investigation, which is Wi-Fi. The idea of Wi-Fi came directly out of that curiosity-based invention. Of course, applied research met it and made something more of it. So I think it would be silly for us to think that we still don't want research from industry to help us solve problems, to make life easier as it has in so many ways. But curiosity-based research must still be there because, frankly, it augments, it complements, it is the foundation for that applied research. And in that way, I think that we must still have government funding or some other great, magnanimous patron who's going to fund curiosity-based research when no industry is going to.
Too much to say on this, except to say that, obviously industry has been important to universities for a long, long time. And that's a very good partnership. We see it on this campus. When it works well, it can work very well. But I'd like to think, and I know later on in the evening, hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about the liberal arts and universities as a social good. I am a little worried by the narrative that we're using more and more with regard to education and healthcare of privatization. In other words, looking maybe to the south of us and saying, well, this must be a better way of doing it. And I've lived in the States for 4 years, others here have as well. And I think it would be very easy to lose what we have in Canada. I think what we have always considered education as a public good, a social good, which can rely on industry for funding certain R&D. But the question ultimately we have to pose as a society is, does industry exist to serve society, or does society exist to serve industry? And I think that universities, of course, are there for R&D, for industry, but universities are that and much more. Universities are, I think we're going through a whole identity crisis. If we see universities as a place to get information, we have the internet. If we see universities as a place for skills training, we have technical schools and trade schools. So university has to be something more than those two things, as important as they are. It has to be connected to community. It has to be there for transformation of the individual and transformation of society. University has a social role to play. If industry can help in that, and we can create all sorts of things that industry and society can benefit from, that is serving a social good. But at the same time, I think universities' vocation includes that, but is much larger.
So I'm just going to make a couple of comments. I think that we'll actually have a lot less curiosity-based research in our institutions. I think there'll be a lot more accountability for what kind of research we do and what impact it has as we go forward. And we're seeing that happen now with targeted funding for research. And I think that that's happened. And I think a part of me thinks for some good reasons. When we look at the different kinds of research we do, and in particular the replication of research over and over again, we've had a good run at it. And I think as resources get tighter, accountability and transparency becomes more of an issue. I think we are going to have to modify how we work and what we do as an institution. I think in working with industries, and I look at the youth today who now anticipate having 4 or 5 careers or jobs, while our parents had one. My dad was a miner. He had one job his whole life. This is not the way it is now. In universities, we're going to have to be nimble, and we're going to have to be more customized to doing training and supporting industry, supporting our young people as they move from job to job, or I think we'll become irrelevant. And I think we're doing that, but not at the pace that I think we're going to have to do. I think we're going to be challenged on some of our traditions like tenure and sabbaticals. They're going to be seen as luxuries that we no longer can afford. And in particular, I know that I was at a meeting with government and they say, show me the value for money you get for sabbaticals. Those are the questions I get asked. Show me how tenure makes it better for professors. And I think those questions are going to be asked to more and more of universities. I say that, and at the same time, universities are one of the most trusted institutions in Canada. They're really still, they're trusted more than churches, they're trusted more than the political system. We are still trusted as universities, but if you look at the narrative that's happening across our country now around universities, and if you look particularly in the Globe today, some of the commentary on the op-ed pieces, we're getting challenged on some of the practices we do. We're much more visible and under the gun, and conversations are getting taped and then released to media, and we need to pay attention, because if we truly want to be relevant, we're going to have to start to be reflective and questioning our own practices, because I think we've been too insular. And I know that my brothers and sisters don't work at a university, and they look at universities as super privileged, and university professors, in particular my brothers who have their own businesses, and they look at us and they shake their heads when they talk to me about universities, or if the university goes on strike, they don't get it. They really, really don't. And they're well educated. They went to university, but they come from an industry where there's no such thing as sabbatical, tenure, any of that, and strike, right? There's no, one of my brothers runs 2 restaurants. They don't go on strike. So they look at us as pretty privileged, and I think that's going to become more prevalent unless we anticipate and pay attention to the critique we're getting now, and we're getting more critique now, I think, than we ever have. We're under the gun, so.
The conversation that we had with some other university presidents at Universities Canada not so long ago, and looking at these trends and looking towards 50 years from now and the impact of technology. And certainly there is a symbiotic relationship between the academy and industry, and research being done, curiosity-based, and for industry and vice versa. And the trend would seem to be that symbiotic relationship is turning into a competitive relationship where I think industry in many cases is moving beyond where universities are. And the example was given by one president to say, my worst nightmare is when Microsoft wakes up and starts their own university, or when Google starts getting into this game, because they already have their own universities internal. The companies are just so large, and their research units are far greater than anything universities can put together. And we were the only game in town for a long period of time, for centuries, as knowledge-based institutions and curiosity-based research and moving society ahead on many different fronts. And now industry has equivalent, if not superior, research capacities and teaching capacities and abilities as well. So as we look towards the future and where those trends are going, industry does look at, I think, our particular industry of the academy or post-secondary education as being $1 billion industry that so far doesn't have any competition. And their, technology has, I think, seen how it can impact on different segments of society and industry killers. Banking and retail, and universities are a very large sector which to date has really insulated themselves against that competition. And so the conversation was that competition is certainly moving from a symbiotic to a competitive relationship, and we're seen as being a next step of, there's a prime element of society that we can move into, and we have to, I think, as President Timmons said, be far more nimble than we have in the past, and moving beyond where we are to where we want to go.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask individual questions to each of the 4 presidents as the next part of this, and this is for Dr. Timmons.
Why don't you go to one of them first?
We can. We can go to John.
Okay.
So in 2017, Campion College marked 100 years of successfully following the tradition of how universities began in our country, with a emphasis focus on the liberal arts. We often hear, though, that liberal arts are under attack or in crisis in post-secondary education. As universities and students' needs continue to evolve, there will always be a place for institutions like Campion College that will have one foot rooted in the liberal arts tradition of 150 years ago. But still, what do they need to do to adapt?
It's a good question. I think all 4 of our institutions certainly embrace liberal arts. I think the problem is particularly acute probably for the federated, because we don't, at least Luther and Campion, don't have professional programs in the way that U of R does. So it's something we're facing head on. It's a case we make not just to students, but to parents who say, we're going to pay all this money for tuition. Where's the job at the end of their liberal arts degree? And what we've been doing at Campion, and the 100th anniversary has been a great chance to do this, is to showcase the success of our alumni. That perhaps in the future there'll be fewer people specializing in liberal arts or fewer English majors or history majors. But what the liberal arts, not only will they still be here in 50 years, but I think they'll be more essential than they are now, and I'll explain why. People who, even in the professional faculties, and I was talking to the Dean of Business earlier, half of their courses are outside of business. And as they often say, if somebody wants to do business in Latin America or Russia, it helps to know something about the language of those places, the culture, the history, etc. You get that from the liberal arts. A lot of our alumni who have done well in the world are people who not just have a specialization, but are able to relate that to various points of view. And I think that's another asset of the liberal arts that we get, is more than one way of seeing an issue. And we look at most organizations in our society, and the people who rise in those organizations are the ones who are able to see various points of view. And so we see a close link between the liberal arts and leadership. That leadership in society, if we want to form global citizens and engage leaders, there's more than just mastery of a skill and mastery of a particular area, as important as those things are. There's the ability to deal with others, to understand others, and to work with them. And when I reflect on our country now, and one of the most burning issues we face, of course, is reconciliation. Reconciliation with our Indigenous friends, and reconciliation on many levels with recent immigrants. We think of culture wars between right and left. We think of accommodation of new immigrants, of interreligious dialogue with Islam and other faiths. And unless we are able to use the liberal arts in order to understand another way of thinking, we will be building walls and not bridges. Our technology with social media is, and other forms are weakening our ability to see other perspectives. And I would make the case that for liberal arts, that's one of liberal arts' main advantage. We've been doing a lot of work at Campion on reconciliation, on reaching out, developing relations with Indigenous peoples. And I would say that reconciliation with Indigenous peoples would be impossible without the liberal arts. Because how can we promote reconciliation without understanding the culture of Indigenous people, their languages, their history, their spirituality? All of that comes to us from the liberal arts. The trades are important, the jobs are certainly important, but I think that universities, although we do prepare people for careers, we have a much bigger role at stake as agents of reconciliation. And I'm so happy, Vianne, with your leadership, all of you, with your leadership I think we've really put U of R as a national leader in that. I came here from Nova Scotia. I knew next to nothing about First Nations, and I can't even begin to tell you how much I've learned about First Nations on this campus.
And you grew up in an area that was surrounded by the Mi'kmaq people.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So that is a very important role, and that's where the liberal arts are at their finest, and that's why we will need them. If the liberal arts suffer, society suffers. We will be less able to understand other points of view, we'll be less able to reach out, and we are really, I think, on the Indigenous issues, on Indigenous relations with migrants and refugees, we have the choice of reconciliation or conflict. And universities have to be pointing the way towards reconciliation.
Thank you. My next question is to Dr. Dockstater.
Is it on reconciliation? Because John answered it.
No, you can go ahead. You have another point?
You talked a little bit about the answer to this question in the opening questions that we had, but we're going to delve a little bit further. Mm-hmm. In his book, Dr. Blair Stonechild of First Nation University has referred to post-secondary education as the new buffalo for Indigenous people in Canada. So looking towards 2067, depending on what happens to universities and how they change, what will take its place as a means for educational, socioeconomic, and political advancement of Indigenous people? What do we need to do now? And I also put this question in the context because FNU is quite unique across Canada. First Nations University of Canada. You've got Indigenous people all across Canada. You've got the North. You've got people that would love to get an education but are limited because of geographic limitations. How do you reach out as part of the way things are going to change in 2067 coming to meet the needs?
Reminds me of one of those exam questions with 5 parts.
Yes.
Should have studied more. Well, first of all, Blair, and it's a quote from Blair Stonechild, and we celebrate our 40th anniversary at First Nations University this year. And Blair Stonechild just happens to be our first professor. So 40 years ago, when we started this wonderful experiment here at the University of Regina, Blair was the first professor hired at the university and is still with First Nations University and wrote a wonderful book about Indigenous education and its past and its future. And education is the new buffalo. What's referred to there is the buffalo in traditional teachings supplied all the needs for Indigenous peoples. Food, clothing, shelter. And in traditional philosophy, there's 2 parts to human development. The first is the things that we need to survive on a day-to-day basis, food, clothing, shelter. That's the buffalo. And because the buffalo provides that, it allows you to expand on the other side of human development, the intellectual. Intellectual, philosophical, epistemological, all the great things that we do as humankind when we don't have to worry about food, clothing, shelter. And that's what the buffalo gave us and the opportunity to develop as a society and a balanced society from there. So if education is the new buffalo, which is it provides us with the ability not only to take care of the basic needs of survival, food, clothing, shelter, but also allows us the opportunity to develop the other part, both as being individuals and society as a whole. The question is premised on the idea that we won't be around 50 years. And like I said at the opening, that when I spoke to the elders, of course we'll be around 50 years. And of course we'll change, but there'll be more of us. And I think the indicators of change are already here. And it happens very quickly. And because change is a fundamental, in Indigenous philosophy, we call it a natural law. That is, change always occurs. We just don't necessarily see it all the time. We're curious about it in the future. We like to crystal ball gaze and get our magic 8 ball and say, I wonder what's going to happen in the future. And it's always exciting. We anticipate change. But when it happens to us, we fear it and we resist it. And when we look at it in the past, it's always something that is routine. And so we already look at the developments that have happened in universities in the last 5 years as almost being routine. But over 5 years, and John, you mentioned this as well, and in your comments, that in 5 years' time, we went from no universities really having substantive elements of Indigenous education built into the universities, generally speaking. There were parts of that. University of Regina, I think, was a leader of that. But now across Canada, every university is interested in Indigenous education. They have elements that are built into pretty well all elements of the university. And that's only growing and expanding. Already we look at that in the past and say, that's kind of routine. Where are we going now? And so it's that element of change. It's occurring now. It's occurring across Canada. There's a strong foundation, I think, now that's built into the academy for Indigenous-based education. I don't think it's going away. It's only going to be growing. So I don't think in any way that education as the new buffalo is going to be extinct. I think it's the opposite. I think we might have reached that somewhere in the past, in the 1970s perhaps, when here in Saskatchewan we came out with Indian control of Indian education, which started First Nations University and started this movement across Canada. So I think that might have been the close to extinction point, but now we're in a period of growth, incredible growth and expansion. And so I don't necessarily see that education as being the new buffalo. Absolutely. It provides, I think, a lot of things for Indigenous peoples, and the Academy has embraced that in many different ways and many different factors across Canada. So I don't see it as going away. I see it increasing, and I see it as being more and more of the new buffalo as we go forward into the future.
My next question is for Dr. Hillis.
Give him a tough one. The questions get tougher as we go along.
Yeah, thanks.
You're president of a faith-based inclusive college that encourages people to think deeply, act passionately, and live faithfully. Yet we live in a world that's increasingly intolerant, and we've talked about that already here, in which fewer and fewer people seem to embrace the values that Luther College espouses. So what do institutions such as Luther College have to do in order to ensure their survival over the next 50 years? What do they offer, and how do you convince people of their value and their relevance?
Thanks, Dr. Greenberg. I want to start with this idea of faith-based because it's a contentious issue for me. Faith-based is not, there's several ways of looking at this, and I want to start, there's an article written by a Lutheran theologian in the United States by the name of Darrell Jodok, and he talks about there being a third path for colleges like Luther College. So there is the sectarian way of looking at the world. This would be, where all the faculty, all the students, the staff are rather homogenous. They come from one faith perspective. They are hired for that faith perspective. There's an expected code of conduct. Jerry Falwell's Liberty University or even Trinity Western in BC could be seen under this, where you have to follow a particular way of being or else you're not allowed to be at that university. That's not Luther College. And then there is the more secular universities, as most of our universities across Canada are, often called non-sectarian or secular. These are religiously inclusive, one could argue, except the religious conversation is often bracketed out. It is not allowed to be part of the conversation. It's something that's there, it's tolerated, but it's not regarded as a way of knowing necessarily. It's not regarded as fundamental to the human experience, except in perhaps an academic study of religion or something like that. On the other hand, you have this third path that Jodok talks about. And I wish I had written this essay because I think it's exactly captures what Luther College and perhaps Campion, I don't want to speak for John and Campion College, but it seems to me that there's a lot of overlap. And this is where we have a college that is certainly founded in a religious tradition and has certain theological foundations to it. But our values are built on top of that, and the values are about things like academic freedom, a pursuit of truth, and humility in that pursuit of truth. And there's certain Lutheran aspects of that, I would argue, which could apply to many other institutions, but we are not going to require that our faculty, our staff, or our students are of one particular brand or religion or creed or gender orientation. So we are extremely inclusive, but we start from a religious foundation in terms of understanding the world. But more importantly, in a world like we have today, colleges like ours are there to help people think through their religious ideas and acknowledge them as legitimate ways of understanding the world. That's not to say that they supplant by any means traditional scientific ways of understanding the world. We teach biology and we teach literature and we teach history exactly as you would find it, physics exactly as you would find it in any other college. But what we do is the religious perspective is seen to be as a legitimate one that has to be seen in the education of the entire person. And we give voice to that, we acknowledge that, and we think that that is actually incredibly important, as referenced by John already, incredibly important in a very diverse religious world, in a very diverse cultural world, in a world now in which we see a spectrum of gender and other orientations. We need to have these perspectives in which we understand each other, in which we understand the other perhaps breaking in as a legitimate way of understanding it. I would argue that colleges like Luther College, and as John has already referenced, Campion College, have a particular role then in playing in reconciliation, certainly, but even just a particular role in understanding the world, where the world is not necessarily within the box of a secular university. So I think that a college like Luther College has a great partnership with a secular institution like the University of Regina, but a voice which needs to be heard and which is heard. And that's one of the great things about the Federation that we have here, but which is heard and which is acknowledged in the lives of our students, and for that matter, in the lives of our faculty and staff.
I have a question for Dr. Timmons, for Vianne. You often say that universities are the best institutions we have because they're a reflection of not of the society we live in, but of the society we want to live in. So if universities change in some form by 2067, what are we going to look at for institutions to show us how we should live our best life as a society?
So I'm going to just tell a little story about my Shakespeare professor when I was doing my undergrad English degree, who would come into class. He always wore a stocking hat and a lit cigarette, and he would lay on the desk and smoke and teach us by talking to the ceiling. And he was considered eccentric and a very accomplished scholar, and we were lucky to hear him pontificate. And he did it really well. He actually was very fascinating and interesting. That wouldn't happen today. We've changed universities in that way that you couldn't lay on your desk, smoke, and talk to the ceiling if you're a professor. Thank goodness, thank goodness. But universities are not a reflection of the society that we want to live in right now. And I'm really worried because I think we're getting further away from it rather than closer to it. Universities should be a place where diverse opinions are able to be expressed and people get introduced to ideas that might offend them, right? And that we build resilience in our students who are going to face opinions that they don't agree with out in society. And we can't and should not protect them from that on our campuses. And we've gone too far, in my view. Universities should be a place with robust debate, respectful difference of opinion. That should be a place that gets your blood going, that gets you really fired up about an issue, and that you can talk to someone else who's fired up about the issue in a different place and walk out smiling. Because if we don't do it here, then we're not going to be able to do it out in society. So universities need to be compassionate, they need to be humane, but they also need to recognize that that's what we are. We are the one place in society where you can come together and have a respectful, robust debate, or you should be able to have a respectful, robust debate and walk out the door. You know, maybe not agreeing, because I don't agree with a lot of things that happen on my campus, but that you respect that people have the right to different opinions. And I'm worried about that. And yet the other side of it is we should be a place that welcomes social justice and diversity. And we're actually not, that's becoming a problem for us because we have, as some of you may know, we had a great talk in Exec Council today about signs being posted around our campus saying it's all right to be white, posted on the Office of Indigenous Advisor to me. You know, it's a movement out of the States, that's an alt-right movement. And it's permeating in it's starting to get into our campuses. So what kind of society do we want to have? Now, we may all have different views, but I think we'd have some constant. We'd want a humane society, a respectful society. We want a society where difference is allowed and supported and honored. We'd want a society where people can respectfully interact when they come from different points of views. That's the kind of society we want. 50 years from now, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, right? So how do we get there will be the question. And it's when you watch what's happening across our country, we're losing on that. We are not viewed now as a place where respectful debate can happen. We're viewed now as pampering our students, overprotective of our students, not allowing anything to offend anyone, not allowing any disruption because it might be painful for someone, right? Well, there was stuff that happened in university that was painful to hear, but we listened and we learned and we disagreed, and that's important. So I hope that we move back and we move closer to becoming a society that we want to live in on our campuses. In many ways, we have it with our diversity on our campus, our inclusiveness, with our compassion on our campus. There's a lot of aspects here where somebody who grew up in a small mining town in Labrador can have their life changed because of given opportunities to go to university. I still believe that happens, that, you know, a young Cree girl from L'Orange can have the opportunity to come here and change her life path. That's what we should be able to do, and that we should do. But we have to recognize that we need to build resilience in our students, and we have to work on that.
Before I open it up to the audience for questions, I have one last question. I thought I'd start with John, then we'll go around. And it's a question that I thought of listening to. You've got 4 presidents here who have come from diverse backgrounds, and many of them have made inroads here. They have esteemed accomplishments. I've got to know them all during my 5 years as a deputy. They have accomplished things. They've been first in a number of categories, and I won't go through each of their backgrounds and their resumes. But the question I have, and we'll start with John, when you think about the legacy that you're going to leave when you finish up, and each of you will finish up at some point in your role as a president, what do you want to leave for this university as a legacy for when you move on to your next life's chapter?
Well, I came into this role a few years ago, and having worked at Campion and as part of the U of R, and one thing I really cherished from the day one was community. This is a community, and the university does not exist in isolation from community. And the federated arrangement, I'm a huge believer in. We have many federated arrangements across this country. And for me, what it speaks to is unity and diversity. Each one of our institutions represents a community or communities. And this works because the respect that Vianne talks about is there. The diversity, I want to pick up from where Vianne left off. The diversity is so important to our university. And my friends who come to university from the private sector or government sector or other walks of life often talk about what they call groupthink. And when they come here, they're just amazed that that doesn't seem to operate at the university, that diversity of opinions is encouraged. And I want that to last. I want that to continue. I don't want the decline in government funding or reliance on government funding or funding from the private sector to undermine that diversity of thought that has to be at the university. A few years ago, the head of the Jesuits spoke to Jesuit educators in Mexico City. Of course, Jesuits have been in education for only 4.5 centuries. And he talked about technology and the globalization that's come about thanks to this great technology that we use every day. But he's saying in a world where we can friend and unfriend with the click of a mouse, he called it the globalization of superficiality, which I think is a wonderful term. We live in a globalized world, but it's not very deep. And for me, what the university is called to do is to encourage students to go to some depth. Depth of thought, depth of inquiry, depth of criticism, depth of development of the human person. And to pick up on what Bryan talked about, the faith-based, etc. When I went to, Mark invited me to the convocation of First Nations in Saskatoon. And as the valedictorian got up, I think she was a young Cree, I'm not sure she's from L'Orange, but from the north of the province. And she talked about the values of First Nations University. The development of mind, body, and spirit, the holistic development based on the medicine wheel. And I leaned over to Mark and I said, that's a lot like what we're trying to do at Campion. Formation of the whole person, mind, body, spirit. Universities are there, I think, to encourage that depth of inquiry at all those levels, and we don't have to agree on them. And that's not the point. But we do have to listen to one another because no one of us has all the right answers. We have to be willing to learn from the other, whatever the other is perceived to be. We have to be able to listen to that and to leave with some sort of understanding of the other if we're going to have a peaceful society based on reconciliation and respect. I don't know if we could have that at Google University or Apple University? Or would they just be doing skills training? It seems that's something that I hope the university never loses. I don't know what my legacy will be, Louise, but I think it's that, about building community, of reaching out and trying to create at least, I haven't been able to, I'm not the president of U of R, I'm the president of Campion. And to encourage spaces at Campion that are safe spaces, welcoming spaces for dialogue. Dialogue, again, to quote another Jesuit, Pope Francis, I love this image of culture of encounter. Can we truly encounter the other? Or do we have to retreat into our own, behind our own walls because we don't want to understand the other? The other is too scary for us. Are we willing to engage that difference and let the other speak to us because we believe that the other has something to teach us? I hope that'll be part of my legacy at Campion, because that's what has given me the most life as president there.
Mark.
So legacy after I leave, is that good? You know something I don't know. Well, that big statue we're building about me. No, it's, I don't know if I really thought about that question at all, but I guess it'd be an easy answer that to leave First Nations University as a leader in Indigenous education in Canada. Again, it's a grand experiment, and I think a leader in many ways, and I want to ensure that leadership role is maintained in the future. But that leadership role, I think, in Indigenous education, and that's defined, broadly in variously different parts of Canada, but to be a leader in Indigenous education in Canada that has a strong foundation in Indigenous knowledge with elders, traditional knowledge holders, as a basis and foundation of how we move forward in Indigenous education in Canada. And that's not only for how people learn about Indigenous people, but how Indigenous people we learn about our own culture. And I think institutions have, the Academy has become, I think, a gathering place for Indigenous peoples to learn more about their culture and ceremonies and interact with elders and traditional knowledge holders. So I believe that that would be a legacy of First Nations University, of how we define Indigenous education, how we do it in a manner of excellence that is a leader in Canada, and shows the way to others of how that can be founded on a very strong, diverse foundation of Indigenous knowledge, philosophy, and epistemology.
Thank you. Bryan.
Well, this was one of those questions that we didn't have in advance, so thanks, Louise. It's a really good question, though. And so, again, I will answer the question as Mark has in terms of being a president of a particular college, although I certainly identify with so much of what John has said, so I could easily just say ditto that. But what I'd like to start with is, when I started at Luther College as an undergraduate in 1974, when I came here as a professor the first time in '84 and again in '89, Luther College had a particular ethnocentric religious mission and identity, which I think has changed a great deal over the years. In part just because we live in a more secular society, in part because Lutheranism has changed, and in part because I think the identity of the college has shifted, as it should, a great deal from being a college that trained young people for vocation in the church to training people for vocation in the world. And that vocation is extremely important. So I'm hoping that the legacy will be still a very strong identity of training people for vocation in the world. I'd like to come back a little bit to one of the other questions. I really believe that the strength of the liberal arts and of a place like Luther College is not just training skills, but giving people an education of what it means to be in the world, to exist in such a pluralistic, such a big global world that they need to be a part of. And Luther College will be that with a religious understanding of what we are. And I hope that identity is strong when I leave. I hope it carries forward in terms of helping think about their place as a religious college, but much more so a college that is there to serve its community. And I see that in some of the initiatives that I have merely facilitated, not really grown. But I see Roger here with the Regional Center of Expertise. We've got the Voluntary Sector Studies Network. We are very much serving the world in vocation and trying to show what it means to live with that religious background and that sense of service to the world. So if the college still has that, despite the fact that it may not have its Lutheran identity as strongly, I think that I will have left the legacy that I was hoping to leave.
So lastly, me?
Yep.
So I hope that when I leave, that the campus celebrates how inclusive it is. Our student body in particular, so that our students, that we focus on our students and continue to focus on student success within an inclusive environment. I hope and I hope that one of the legacies that I leave is that we have College Avenue campus and Dark Hall opened. And the third is that I hope that we continue to be a humane campus with great pride. I'm so proud of this institution. I'm proud of the students that come here. I'm proud of the faculty who do such amazing teaching and research. I'm proud of our staff who work so hard for our students to ensure they're successful. I'm proud of our community that embraces this university. So this pride that I have, I hope is there within our campus and in our community. And to me, it's tangible. That I'm so excited about Congress coming because I can't wait for people across Canada to see this amazing, beautiful campus, to see how they're welcomed into our city and into our campus community, to see how we serve and support them when they come for the Congress experience. That is a legacy that I hope, and it's not me leaving, we leave, because to me, I remember when I got the job and people said to me, "You're going to University of Regina?" And now, I hear, I'm hearing great things about the University of Regina. And they're hearing great things because we have great faculty, great staff, and great students. And we care deeply about each other. And that is a legacy that we've left. Not me, that we've left.
Thank you. Well, we have an opportunity now to take several questions from the audience, and then we will wrap up, and there's a little bit of a reception afterwards. So if you have questions, can you please come to the mic and can you identify yourself?
Hi, I'm Roger Petrie. I'm a philosophy professor at Luther College. I'm really pleased with all of your comments this evening, and I almost felt an obligation to come here as a philosopher this evening, partly because this debate is something that's kind of at the heart of philosophy. And I wanted to say a few words about that, and then maybe you can respond to some of what I'm saying. So you were talking about the universities going back to the 1200s. Well, of course, the universities go back further, and that, of course, goes back to Aristotle's Lyceum, and before that, Plato's Academy, right? And Machiavelli, the political theorist, said, whenever an organization is in crisis, it gets drawn back to its original starting points. And those original starting points were the good things that brought everybody together to form the institution in the first place. Well, so we have to go all the way back to Plato's Academy to figure out, well, what are the starting points of the university? What is it that these philosophers were interested in? And there's two key things that give flexibility to the university that allows it to constantly meet crises in the future. The one key thing, of course, is the thing that philosophers love, philosophia, to be lovers of wisdom. And I love that you kept speaking about wisdom, because that is that weird amorphous concept that we keep building on in the academy. We never lose the old. I mean, the thing about a university, it's like an onion. It just adds layer upon layer upon layer. The old knowledge gets reinvented with the new knowledge. So that's the one thing, is that focus on wisdom. And as philosophers, we debate wisdom, and so you end up getting new philosophies. So the last new philosophy, big one, was natural philosophy, which of course we call science. But of course, that was pioneered as a kind of wisdom. And that Francis Bacon says, this is a kind of wisdom. The other key element of philosophy is that we have flexibility in our methods. Unlike any other discipline, we're a holistic discipline where we can build whatever we want. And when the university is in crisis and when there's new knowledges, we kind of have to figure out, and everybody starts reading philosophy, because all the disciplines have to kind of reinvent themselves. And so I think that's partly I felt an obligation to be here just because this was a question. But the second thing is there's key parts of the academy that we forget. I mean, what we pursue curiosity knowledge, which is often seen as useless. But today's useless knowledge all of a sudden becomes very useful in a crisis. All the useless knowledge that we've been gathering around biology, around the social sciences and humanities, all of a sudden we're moving into sustainable development where all the neglected capitals of the market, right? The market doesn't care about human capital until recently. It really doesn't care about natural capital until recently. And it really didn't care about social capital aside from market norms. And all of a sudden, oh, wait a second, it's our sociologists, it's our humanists. Those are the people who are going to be kind of in the driver's seat, which is a strange thing. And I don't think government understands that. I really don't think they realize that the very parts of the university that are often seen as not critical, those are the ones that hold the keys to the kingdom, in a way. But the other neglected part, and this is, with philosophy, it's about self-knowledge. And so similarly with universities, we need self-knowledge. When universities make major transitions, the key way they make major transitions, so if you think of the invention of science and the Royal Society of London, it was the older parts of the university that came forward, helped rebuild. So it was that older craft knowledge that allowed the instrumentation, that allowed scientific experiments. If you go to the rise of humanism, it was the old language scholars who came up and ended up developing the new methods that, of course, led to the Reformation and all of these sorts of things. And nowadays, of course, the older part of the university isn't the scientists. The older part of these humanists are going to be the ones who have to kind of step forward and raise the old and the new. So I guess my question to you is, I imagine the things I'm saying, all the things that often the large figures, the industry, the things they think is useless, the philosophers, the social scientists, the humanists, the older parts of the university, the language scholars, those are the ones that if we understand ourselves, it's like, oh my God, that's what we have to be working on as scholars, because if we know our history, they're the key parts of the university. So is anything of what I'm saying ringing true? And if so, how as a university do we defend those pieces that are so vital to making that major transition to a sustainable future that outside world seems not to even understand?
Roger, I want to thank you for taking us back to ancient Greece. We need a philosopher here to do that. I really welcome what you said by going back to the origins. And I like that you mentioned wisdom. It came up, we talked about indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge. We talked about the knowledge-based economy. We talked about skills training. We don't talk often about wisdom. And I would like to think that in our institutions, and one thing we would recognize is that nobody has a monopoly on the truth, whether there even is an absolute truth. But we do think that through dialogue, through listening, we can come to a closer understanding of the truth. So I want to applaud you about wisdom. But there was a second thing the ancient Greeks talked about, and that was eudaimonia, the good life. The good life. That's what brought them together. What is the good life? Let me tell you a story about the good life. Not that Jesuits live the good life, but anyway. That's not the good life I'm talking about. A couple other works we have here in Regina, there's Mother Teresa Middle School, but there's also Friends on the Outside, Photo. It's a support group for guys getting out of jail. And we meet every Thursday night at Western Pizza and have coffee. Well, there's one of our members who he started reading in jail, and his teacher, then he went to SIIT, great institution, and his teacher said, you know what? Why don't you do this reading test? He scored 100%. And then she said, you know what? You could get into university. And I'm proud to say that Jason is now a member of our university. He's enrolled at First Nations University. He's spoken at the Aboriginal Student Center. And his life before university, before prison, was the drug scene in North Central. He bought and sold drugs. He talks openly about this. He didn't know there was a world beyond that. As he admits, he didn't know what empathy was. And when his professor at First Nations University went around the class and asked the students, why are you here? By the way, I asked my students that too. And interestingly, my Indigenous students will almost always say, to help my community. something I don't always hear the non-Indigenous students say. His answer was to become a better person. In all my years of teaching, I've never had a student say that. I'm here to become a better person. And then he spoke at the Aboriginal Student Center quite movingly about his life of crime, about he said, before I saw the world like this, he said, now I see the world, no, I saw the world like this, now I see the world like this. University has opened up his horizons, and the other day I walked by the Lab Cafe and he was sitting there with his children. And he said, I'm here with my children to let them know that this is where they're coming when they grow up. So that eudaimonia, the search for the good life, the university should never give that up, because we're dealing with people often who have quite narrow views. And I'd like to think that university is a place you come to have your views expand, to open up your horizons, to see not only what it means to be human, but what is your contribution to this world, your vocation. And I hope that our students are transformed here so that they can go out and transform the world. So that search for the good life, I think, will always be with us, of what it means to live a good human life. And for that, all of our disciplines, all of our faiths and ways of knowing should be brought to bear so that our students can make those decisions and to lead the good life.
I'm just going to brief comment on there because it is interesting, because again, it brings me back to my opening comment of where are the starting points. And so when I talked to the elder, universities, and said, well, it depends on where your starting point and your perspective is. But I think what First Nations University brings to the larger conversation, and here talking about philosophy as well, when we go back to our starting points, we don't necessarily go back to Greece. We don't necessarily go back to Greece as saying that's where philosophy began, that's where democracy began, that's where the world began, diffusionist theory, ethnocentrism. I mean, we bring the other perspective of saying here in North America, we have a long history of philosophy. We have a long history of what is the good life, what does education mean with respect to the buffalo. So all those teachings we bring, like I said, to that conversation as well, to say that there are different starting points. And I said, I think President Timmons said it well, there's a diversity and respect for a diversity here, and I think First Nations University here at the University of Regina has been a leader in that, and bringing those perspectives to bear when we talk about these things and saying, what is a sustainable future and how do different philosophies bear on that particular question? Well, it's not just Western philosophies, there's Indigenous philosophies, Indigenous elders and knowledge holders who can bring, I think, that knowledge to bear as well. So there is that respect and that diversity that comes with a holistic understanding.
I think we're at a time we can challenge ourselves, because that education that you talked about, Roger, also is invisible about women. Like, it is a very male kind of oriented, and that's what part of the pushback we're feeling now. That we didn't have Indigenous people in our history. We ignored the culture, we ignored the art. Well, the same with women. I can remember taking literature courses in which there was not one woman author presented to me, right? So we have to reflect on, and we have to change as universities to better reflect our societies, or we are going to become obsolete, because finally, people are saying, me too. Hashtag me too, right? For different reasons, but they're doing it, right? Because we're saying we are part of the history, but we as universities haven't reflected that. And so we still have a ways to go, I believe. And I'm excited because I think we're at a turning point, a really dramatic one, around truth and reconciliation, but also around, looking at our curriculum with a more critical eye, being more self-reflective as an institution. And if we don't, I think we're in trouble.
A quick question.
I'll try to make it a quick one. I'm also picking up on Vianne's point about the possible reduction of curiosity-driven research, because it got me thinking differently about the general question of the debate, which is, will there be universities in 2067? And it just sent me off on a different thinking track. It reminded me of how diverse the referents of the term university are. If you go all over the world, there are universities funded by states and then private universities. There are universities that only have vocational programs, others that are really focused on liberal arts, natural sciences, and do not have vocations. So what you call a university is so diverse. I have yet to find a single set of defining points. This is what a university is. I know the university I want, and that's why that point about curiosity-driven research got me thinking. Vianne said that there will likely be less curiosity-driven research, and from some perspectives for good reason, because, well, research driven by curiosity is expensive. We are professors. We are an expensive bunch. Right now, a professor's salary may be $40,000, $50,000 a year. With this division of research, teaching, and service, about $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year going into our research. Is it worth it for society to invest that much money in us? The same with investing in sabbaticals for us to do our research, and in giving us job security through tenure. My own hope will be that you will fight very hard to protect our right to do curiosity-driven research. For me, the alternative is a really static or quietistic view of knowledge. That which we have a perspective on that John was speaking about, that is a changing thing. What is the good life? That is not a static entity. That is an ongoing process. And you have people researching that out, talking to Indigenous peoples on what is this good life we're talking about? Is it the same now as it was 50 years ago? So I find that giving up on our really research-rich universities, even if it's a small, humble universities in the prairies, would be a serious loss. I think it would be this. It would exacerbate a class system between post-secondary institutions where you would have the Torontos and the UBCs of the world and the Harvards and the Chicagos where real research happens, and then you would have teaching-intensive colleges everywhere else where what basically we, and I'm imagining me as a professor in one of these, quote, humbler institutions would be doing is reproducing knowledge produced by others. That's not what I do. I think of us, even all of us. We're I mean, pardon the macho image, pioneers, fighting the good fight at the cutting edge. It might not be the huge cutting edge, sharp and glitzy, but we're there, and that really feeds into what we teach our students, and it keeps thought diverse. We do not necessarily think the same way the hotshot researchers in Toronto do. We're doing our own little thing here, creatively and on the basis of our research. So I wanted to protect that, and I wanted your assurance that this really matters to you at this point. The alternative would be to say, yes, back to the main question of the debate, there will be universities in the future, but it's not the university we have now, if research is not a part of it, curiosity-driven research. So I picked up that tack of Vianne's.
I would tell you that we have that in Canada now with the U15. We have that. We have a group of universities that have decided that they are the research universities and everyone else is not, and are advocating and fighting for that. And so the question is, what is our role? Well, we have to continue. In particular, the comprehensive universities are research intensive. They are research intensive universities. So when I hear, one of my colleagues say, well, we are the research intensive universities, I always remind them, I said, so are we. Who has the monopoly? Some of the small undergrad institutions are research intensive and proud of it and doing some fabulous work in this country. And so we need to celebrate that and remind us. But I'm not under any illusion that there's a group of universities that have labeled themselves as a U15 and that have taken on the mantra of being research intensive and everyone else is not. And that has been a destructive movement in Canada, very destructive, and I think it's problematic, and I voice it all the time.
So what you're suggesting to me is the onus is on you and on us to continue making the case for the importance of research at every level.
Yes.
Okay. I could live with that.
And could I just jump in, Carlos? I think what I heard, Vianne, was still defending curiosity-based research.
Oh, yes.
But we will have to figure out, and I'm not saying this is a problem, it's just that we're going to have to be sure that we figure out how that can be accountable to, let's face it, our chief patron being the government of Saskatchewan. And that's difficult to do. And I think you put your finger on it when you said it's quite an expensive venture we're involved in. And that's a difficulty that we have that doesn't in any way diminish, for me at least, the importance of curiosity-based research. We just have to make sure that they understand why it is so important. And I don't think we can stop talking about it, because as applied research, I mean, we see this even in a council funding, right? I mean, it's all about applied research, increasingly at least. So we're going to have to figure out how, even amongst our own, within our own circles of the academy, that curiosity-based research does not lose its credibility. I think that conversation has to continue.
And Carlos, when I talked about tenure and sabbatical, I wasn't saying I don't think tenure and sabbatical is valued. I'm saying it's going to be challenged. And I believe it's going to be challenged. And because I hear it when I go to present the budget to government, I'm defending in front of them tenure and sabbaticals, and I'm defending it in the community. I hear about it in community from people who are not university professors. They don't understand it, and they don't honor it.
It's becoming harder to justify when we meet with the government. Carlos, you've got a lot of good points in what you said, and one of the things that I take away from it is, what is a university? There are lots of institutions that call themselves universities. Are they really? Is Google University, go back to that image, is that really a university? And I'll take, my other takeaway from this evening is curiosity-based research. I think that, again, to go back to the foundation of the university, the word itself means universe, of the whole, And from the humanist tradition, the motto of humanism is, nothing human is foreign to me. So nothing that is part of the human experience should be foreign at the university. The university should be a place of inquiry, of teaching and research on everything that is human, of our politics, of our history, of our religion, of our everything. That is fair game. And if I think what we have to be careful against is reductionism, that says, well, the only research, we have to have tangible benefits of your research or else it's not important. If your research is related to what it means to be human, it is truly university. The day when universities jettison that, they're no longer universities in my view, because they're no longer of the whole. They've taken part of the human experience and said, that's all we're going to research, and we don't want to look at the spiritual experience. We don't want to look at women's experience. We don't want to look at indigenous experience. We only value this experience because that's what the market wants. Then you're no longer in a university, you're in something else. And I think that's what we really have to defend against. I think that was a great achievement of the humanist tradition. Nothing human is foreign to me, and therefore all the research we do, there's no element of human experience that should be foreign at the university. And we're trying to understand that experience on all levels, psychology, all the things that we teach, we should be trying to help our students understand that better.
We've got, I think, two people, and I'm cognizant of time too. I know some have got to make treks to go home, so we'll try to keep this short, both the answers and the questions.
Stilling from engineering. I'll keep this short because I'm short myself, so that's easy to do. Even though I'm one of those professors where the only thing that we know is to speak either in 60-minute time frames or an hour and a half. But nonetheless, I liked very much that you guys focused on values and principles in defining what the University of the Future is. And the ones that I took away from each of you was developing this sense of community, this sense of belonging, and a sense of safety, and a sense of diversity, and being able to interact and express your opinions, and to develop as a whole. And I'd like to add to that, when I'm listening to some of the questions here, I also got a sense of sustainability, sustaining that ability to continue. Now I'm going to ask the hard question now. What is the difference then from our universities of today and the principles and values that we embody and uphold and strive in our delivery compared to what we see our University of the Future to be?
Well, can I start? I think an easy answer, and I'm sure you know this, but I'll say it anyway, is that with technology, we really don't need to worry about delivering information anymore. It's all there. And so I think universities of the future will be much more about learning and how we learn and how we understand our learning and how we understand that context for the knowledge. Because as my good wife has said, when I'm caught around the supper table saying something that's patently untrue, my kids catch me out now right away on the smartphone, and we know that. So knowledge is there. We don't, as universities, I think there has been, and especially in an industrial form of university that we have, it's been this delivery of knowledge. And none of us identify that, none of us really want to be that, but we have, in all honesty, become that. In the future, that's just not relevant anymore. And we will be forced to be truly delivering an education in which people are learning how they learn. They'll be self-reflective about coming to an enhanced wisdom, as I would call it.
So we'll keep the same values and principles. So rather than like what we tend to do is we sort of forecast into the future, but now that we have these same principles and values, can I have you backcast and go back from what you see this technology of the future, or how we achieve it, because there's so many paths to do it, to reach our end goal with these principles. Can you backcast from 50 years, and now backcast 25, and then backcast 5? We so want to go, and I know I can see a few eyes crossing. You look like my students, just totally lost with me, where you want to say, well, I know where I am now, let me just think in 5 years where I want to be. But I would like you to go to where you want to be with those principles and values 50 years from now, and look back and say, where do I see that milestone 25 and then 5, rather than saying, this is where we're at. We're in these traditional rooms. We're still using projectors or PowerPoints. We're sending people off, having them come back. But with those principles and values, can you go back halfway and then almost to where we are today? And do we have to change our course? Thank you.
Thank you.
Last question.
Yep, and it'll be quick. Chris Yost from biology, and I wasn't going to stand up until Carlos got up, and then it kept me thinking, because I was very concerned about hearing this idea. So I look to presidents to be the champions of the academic mission. And so I do need that reassurance from President Timmons that when she said that she sees curiosity-based research declining, that this is being fought tooth and nail to the end, because for 2 points. And I would very strongly argue that it's not, we shouldn't perseverate on the word curiosity. Curiosity is too nebulous. What it really is, it's unbounded discovery-based research. Because curiosity leads to discovery, and it's the discoveries that we're all seeking. Whatever kind of the discovery that is, and it just transcends science, it transcends philosophy, it is discovery. And it is the university that's the only place that has unbounded discovery. Google University won't have the unbounded, it will still be driven with a certain mindset. And so I will be here, I will be probably dead by 2067, many of us will, but for as long as I'm here, I will do discovery-based research. The other point is that the tenure, that was the other thing that concerned me, this idea that tenure is under attack. I worry that we are doing ourselves a disservice by not, again, correcting people about what tenure is. Tenure is not job security. I can get fired, I can get laid off, but what tenure protects me to do is that unbounded discovery. Tenure allows me to go wherever I want to in terms of asking the questions I want to. And as you said, that's what we have to protect, because that will protect that. We don't protect students, we're not driven into a certain thought. So when I hear you say that curiosity-based research will decline and tenure may disappear or sabbaticals will go, I don't want to hear that. I want to hear, or if I'm going to hear that, then I want to hear how we're going to protect it. Because we need to protect the academic missions. Universities will be here in 2067, right? Will they exist? Of course they'll exist. And that was well distributed, well eloquently said tonight. That gave me confidence. I came here with great reservations when I first saw that title. So I'm still leaving with some reservations, but I did hear a lot of good things tonight. I still am concerned that we're not doing the right job when it comes to discovery-based research and protecting that.
So, Chris, my comment about saying that I think it will be on the decline is because it has been on the decline in terms of funding. Look at the federal government who just invested millions and millions of dollars in superclusters that are very directed, focused research areas. Millions of dollars in that. When SHIRK funding increased under the last government, it was targeted to business. The only SHIRK money that increased was in the business portfolio and envelope, very targeted. So if that trend continues, we will have less discovery research, curiosity-based research, and it is of concern, and it's something we all need to be aware of, and we all need to work and advocate, not just the presidents, all of us on that. The same, I would do you a disservice if I didn't tell you that tenure and sabbaticals are being questioned. They are, by government in particular, and not just our government. It's a conversation presidents have across Canada, and we are. If you'd been, well, you were there, Louise, when I was questioned on sabbatical and tenure, we firmly and very clearly defend it and educate the people who challenge it, because they don't come from a place where they understand it, right? And so when I say that can be a trend or that may happen, doesn't mean that I would advocate for that to happen. That's two different issues. I mean, I wouldn't be a university president if I didn't value research, teaching, and the amazing institutions we have, in which Canadians have a lot of faith in, right? I mean, this has been my vocation. And so all of us feel that way, but you also have to look at what's happening in reality, and you have to talk about it so that you can defend what we have. If we put our heads in the sand and ignore it, we'll be vulnerable. So I hope I've helped you when you said you want President Timmons to say that she supports curiosity-based research. Well, myself, I still research. I do curiosity-based research. Pardon me?
Discovery-based research.
Discovery-based research. I still do it myself. So it's something I value, and I will continue to value and promote and advocate for, as my colleagues do, right?
I think we're at a real crossroads. I think that we really have to get out into the public. The reason why government can cut our funding is because voters view healthcare as a much higher priority than higher education. And we have not done a good job at communicating the value we bring to society. Because when you get right down to it, the university does not belong to industry. The university does not belong even to government. The university belongs to society.
Not us, it doesn't belong to us.
And I think we've done I know Vianne has done this recently to remind people, the public and others, how much the university contributes economically to this area. And I think back at my own childhood growing up in Antigonish, small university town in Nova Scotia. It was so different than the towns around it. They went boom and bust based on the fisheries and forestry. Our town was always
steel mills,
stable economically. And that's something that we have to convey to society. But beyond that, on a personal level, university opened up a world for me that might not have existed if I had been in a place that didn't have a university. And I think it's that gateway to opportunity that is so important for universities, whether we're talking about Indigenous people or any other population that really needs that opportunity. When I talk with my Indigenous colleagues, it's funny, I don't hear a whole lot of questioning about will there be universities. They obviously see the value of it and are investing in it, and that they do see that as the way of the future. So,
and parents want their kids to go.
Yeah, I think that's what we have to, tenure and the other issues. I mean, those are things that if government is cutting us, it's because people out there don't understand us. And that's what we have to work on. We have to talk to your neighbors, talk to the people you meet at the soccer games when you're taking your kids out, and explain to them what you do and why it's important. And I think we really have to do a much better job at that to remind people of the social value that universities bring.
And I know, Chris, you've been a real advocate of that, and I want to just compliment our communications. And I think you've said that to me too, that they've been a real focus on research stories, research successes, at least in our local newspaper and in the news media that we have. So it's something we've got to continue to do and really focus on, or we'll become be seen as not relevant to the community.
Thank you. I'm going to make a few comments and then let
Then I'll
Vianne have the
close.
last word. It's been a great discussion today. I think that we've covered a number of topics. And they're topics that have interest to all of us. And I know we could go on and talk for another hour. I always felt I spent many years at the university. I went out and worked in government for a number of years, and I've come back. And, universities always remind me it's a great place to meet, discuss, learn, and grow. And I got reminded of that listening to today's discussion, because it is about growing and making your community a better place and making yourself a better person. This discussion, though, will continue on about what universities are, how they contribute to each of us individually, what they do to the community, and also how they can change people's lives. So I know this is not a topic that will end today, and I could see that some of you have got great passion and interest. So thank you. I'm going to and thank you to all our panel members for agreeing to be here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Vianne to say a few words.
This will probably be the last Forward Together lecture that we do. We've kind of agreed that on that as a collective. But it's also been a lecture series that we're all been very proud of, and I think has brought us together in a really meaningful way. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Dr. Greenberg, who stepped up when John Hopkins this morning told us he could not come and moderate. And so we have a real advocate in her. She was a great deputy minister, worked with me for 5 years. 5 years in supporting our institution, and is still doing that on some short notice. So we have, for you, this is done by one of our fine arts students who we commissioned to do original painting. This young man, I would tell you, buy his paintings now because he is so talented, and I'm going to go to his little apartment and pick out some paintings because I know that they're going to be worth a lot of money in the future. But also, the other thing the universities do that we didn't talk a lot about was they still keep art, culture relevant in our communities, and we need to make sure that they do, because our governments have not been investing in arts and cultures in our communities, especially in the last budget. They got some difficult cuts, and this student did this for you, Louise, and I hope that you hang it and remember your 5 years with us, but also of all the students that you affected, because you don't get to see each day like I do, them in the hallway when you work in government, but what you do is support students and support them in their transformation on changing their lives. Like that little girl from L'Orange who will come on our campus, and maybe our next Prime Minister, because she gets an education. So here we go.
you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. And thank you to my colleagues. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. There's a reception just out the doors for coffee and treats.
Thanks, Louise.
Thank you.